Unlike any other TCG, Magic the Gathering handles its resource management system in a very unique way, but in this process has it been the cause of why great land cards are so expensive. But now before we get into pricing out our lands, let's figure out how Magic's way of resource management is different and why it matters. Magic the Gathering has a resource management system of shuffling up your resources or your lands into your deck and having to draw into them to play for turn. A very simple process that can be described in a sentence, but it is in fact making it stand out drastically from the other TCG counterparts. We can look at new modern TCGs like One Piece and Riftbound, which takes the shuffling of your resources into your main deck completely out of the equation. They have their own resource deck that you flip from every turn, taking out the luck of drawing into resources to play. One Piece also has all of its resources, or Don, be able to pay for anything that you need, not separating colors like Magic. And while Riftbound does separate its resources into different colors, since they are only two-colored decks, you aren't really ever worried about what colors you need to pay for cards unlike Magic, them only having basic mono-colored resources. We also have other card games like Lorcana and Star Wars Unlimited that take out having a resource card from their game entirely, as what you do is on your turn, you play a card from your hand face down, which now will act as a resource, once again taking out the need to color fix and draw into your resources. And finally, even looking at older TCGs like Pokémon that have you still shuffle your energy into your main deck, they still don't have very high costing resource cards like Magic. Pokémon, again like Riftbound, only has the single color energy, no duels or tri-lands like in Magic, and also these energy cards are only used to usually power a Pokémon's attack, not needed normally to play items or trainer cards, whereas Magic will almost always make you tap at least a land to play a card. And so I'm sure that you get it, Magic is different. Whereas other TCGs take their resources and have it more of an afterthought for its players, you have to actively think while building and playing about how you're going to get the right colored lands out and have enough. You have to shuffle in your lands, you have to use lands to pay for everything, and you have to color fix and get all of your colors for your deck to run smoothly, a thing where no other TCG has all three pinch points. And so why does this all matter? And I would say that it matters for whenever you look at TCGs as a whole and see that Magic is really the only TCG to have a big market around their land cards. Pokemon's Energy, Riftbound Runes, One Piece's Dawn cards, while all of them have cool art variants you can get for a pretty penny, you can usually go to your local game store and get all of these resources cards that you need for a deck for a couple bucks, or for free if the owner is a G like that. And to an extent, this also works for Magic. Most LGSs will give you a good deal on picking up a lot of basics, or just let people have them for their decks, but let's not be naive here. Most deck builders know that any deck really over two colors isn't going to run consistently smoothly without a lot of non-basic lands. And unlike any other TCG, non-basic lands are a staple and necessary part of building multicolored decks. But now that statement that I just brought up begs a question in and of itself. Three-color decks sure are going to need their fair share of non-basic lands, but can't most two and monocolor decks get away with running only basics or just some cheap non-basics and have a functional deck? And so I gathered some numbers to try to find out. One of my other recent videos, I went over how expensive Bracket 3 can be in the modern day of Magic Commander, and I had a lot of great comments giving some good feedback on how I gathered my data, but one of the biggest takeaways that I found interesting was people asking me to take a look at the land cost of these Bracket 3s and how much they are kind of tainting the data of how expensive all of those decks ended up being. And so we're going to look at monocolored, two-color, and three-color commanders and see what their EDHREC average deck list in Bracket 2 and Bracket 3 are to try and see if we can find a pattern in the numbers. And while I pop up our first batch of data for the monocolored commanders, I do want to preface that using EDHREC is not going to be a perfect representation of the average paper deck list, and by no means am I calling this data a perfect reflection of modern day Commander, but it is a decent sample size that we can use to try and find how expensive mana bases can be throughout the brackets and color combos. And so now as we go to the actual data for our monocolored commanders, there are three main things I want you to look at. First, of course, being how much these mana bases cost. The next being just how many basics make up the deck. So if we look next to the price on SRAM, we can see that in Bracket 2, 29 of the 34 lands are basic lands. And then the final thing to look out for is if there are any outliers that I found in these mana bases. What I classified as an outlier is any one land that is around half or more of the mana base's value. So as we can see with Tiny Bones in Bracket 2, its average mana base is $46.30, but $30 of that is just in one land card, Cabal Coffers. So now as we move to the average cost of a monocolored commander deck, we can see that bracket 2, the average mana base is $33.03, and with no outliers it goes down to $21.16. For bracket 3, the average mana base is $108.44, but with no outliers it almost gets cut in half, down to $56.20. And like a lot of people commented on my last video, I think it's really important to take a look at the outliers in this. A lot of people when building decks online are going to put in just more optimal cards than they would in paper, and there's things like people pulling a lucky card from a pack that they just want to put into a deck, and there's a lot of situations where like Golem, it's bracket 3 being $138.08, but I don't think a lot of players really want to pay for Urborg, which is making up half of that mana base's value. And so while we are looking at a EDHREC dataset, I would say that paper decks are somewhere in the middle, but I would lean closer to the lower number of the no outliers portion for the actual cost of paper decks mana base. And then to round off our dataset, our monocolored decks run around 86.07% of basics as their mana base. And of course, I'm going to guess that this percentage is going to go down a lot as we add more and more colors to our decks, and non-basic lands are going to get more necessary. And that's going to lead me into my next dataset of the 2-colored commanders in bracket 2 and 3. And for the most part, these numbers kind of stayed relatively the same to a monocolored commander deck. As while we do get high ends in bracket 2 like Ketramos at $84, we get really low ends like Marin and Arabella that are both under $20. And so now as we go to the average cost, for bracket 2 it's going to stay around the same at $36.04, and with no outliers going down $4 to $32.80. Bracket 3 is where we're really going to see that big jump, as the average cost is $96.73, and with no outliers it's going to stay relatively high at $80.48. And then in this dataset, dual colored commander decks run around 63.46% basics as their mana base. And I think a big reason for the jump up is obviously adding in another color to our deck means that we have more access to better lands that can tap for both of our colors. And on top of that, I think a big reason is just the lack of outliers in this dataset. The only outliers being Urborg and Three Tree City, as a lot of the mana bases just had a lot of cards from the $10 to $15 range, where there was too many of them to classify one as an outlier. And I would make the assumption as we move to our 3-color commanders that there's going to be even less outliers in this dataset. And as you can see, this is true, as in bracket 3 there was no outliers in our 3-color commanders. And I was kind of suspecting that the triomes like Jetmir's Garden would be outliers, but I'm kind of shocked that they're only outliers in bracket 2. So it was very interesting to see that almost all of these decks had things like fetch lands that were matching the prices of these triomes, really not having an outlier to stand out. And so now as we move to our average cost of our 3-color commanders, in bracket 2 the average cost of a mana base is $41.83, with no outliers being $34.96. Then as we move to bracket 3, it jumps all the way up to $181.29, and with no outliers not giving it an extra price point. And then in this dataset, 3-colored decks run around 48.37% of basics as their mana base. But so now I have 2 big questions I want to ask myself and answer in this video. As why do I think the difference of bracket 2 and 3 is so great? As we go back and look at all of our average cost from our 1, 2, and 3-color commanders, we can see that there's only around a $10 difference between the average bracket 2 of a monocolored and tricolored commander. Compare that though to bracket 3s between dual and tricolor commanders, we go from $96, tripling it to $181 basically. And I think a big portion is just the actual separation between bracket 2 and bracket 3. As the biggest differences between bracket 2 and 3 is the added benefits of game changers and speeding up the average win or loss by 2 turns, going from at least an 8-turn game to a 6-turn game. And so while sure I would say that game changers and other really big stable cards are going to help you speed up to those wins, I would say that a big portion is actually upgrading your mana base to have a consistent deck. I would say that someone playing a bracket 2 deck is going to be punished much less for having tap lands, as everyone else at the table is going to be slowly building up their resources and the game's going to last a little bit longer, not really punishing a player for not having all of their colors early or having some tap lands. But now moving to a bracket 3 player, you're going to be expected to be reactive to people pushing for a win without really building up. Spellslinger decks are going to go for a win unexpectedly, and you're kind of expected to be able to stop it. As now players are being punished for having tap lands, that is going to make them unable to react where a untapped land would let them. And that would be my biggest argument as to why there's this giant price hike from 2 to 3 in almost all of our datasets. As while both 2 and 3 are technically classified as casual brackets, there's still a very big jump in competitiveness from 2 to 3 that cannot be understated, and I think we can see it clearly through the mana base price increase. And now to circle off for my final question that I proposed at the beginning of the video, why is it important to know why lands are expensive? And this comes from, like I mentioned before, how Magic has unique problems that players have to solve while playing. Things like being mana screwed, mana flooded, having to color fix, all of these things attribute to the high prices for lands. Certain lands that can enter untapped under certain scenarios, and lands that have the basic land types on them so they are searchable, all can attribute to high prices, and not only the lands themselves, but high prices for cards that search for them. This is why certain lands like Surveil lands and Fetch lands can have a high price tag, because they can either search for other lands to color fix you, or themselves can be searched for. And I'm not really here to complain about the high prices of lands, I'm rather here to ask the question if you are analyzing lands correctly. As I would say that in most Boros decks, I would not recommend the card Elegant Parlor, even though it's an $8 land card. Sure, it's going to have our basic land types of Mountain and Plain so that we can search for it, and it's going to let us surveil, but in most Boros decks, is that even stuff that we care about? As for one, we're not really in colors that are strong for getting stuff out of the graveyard with Surveil, and the Mountain and Plains subtype is not really going to help us, as since we're not in green, we're not going to be able to search for this land consistently. In the end, this being just a much more expensive scry land, doing the exact same thing just for a higher price tag. And you can make this case for a lot of different types of lands in your decks, but I won't drag it on, I think you get the picture. As Magic has one of the most unique ways of handling its lands and resource management compared to other TCGs, and I think it's really important you know why this is happening whenever you're deciding which lands are worth it or not worth it for your decks.